Uh, just double checking. It doesn't. Okay, it doesn't actually look like I get a head count anywhere. But people who are tuning in today, thanks for joining so much. I'm glad to be participating with a lot of other really cool people, including Daniel Mars Patrick and a few others who are all doing some awesome presentations and webinars for Enterprise DNA today. My name is Reid Havens. I'll get into my background here a little bit, but I've been in the MVP space for quite a long time, and I'm going to show some really cool stuff related to design, aesthetics, and kind of cool little wizardry and other magic tricks in Power BI today. But let me give a little bit of background about myself before we actually get into what we'll be talking about today as well. So there we go. Yeah, as I mentioned, my name is Reid Havens. I am a four-time running MVP now from Microsoft. I've been in this space now for about 8 or 9 years, and have been with Power BI before it started, back when it was Power View, went back in the day with an Excel plugin, and using Power Pivot way back when. And as the product has evolved, so have I with it. I over the years kind of found a fun little practice to move myself towards aesthetics and design. I found that not as many people do that versus modeling and reporting. So it's a niche in the market that I have just found myself naturally kind of embracing over the years. Looks like somebody's from Uruguay. Welcome so much to the session today. Overall, I have found that over the years, I've really also found a lot of enjoyment from doing presentations like this, making content for my YouTube channel, lots of ways to give back to the community and just really interact with people in a way that's fulfilling and rewarding that developing doesn't do nearly as well. Though at the end of the day, projects with clients are what still pay the bills. But this is fun for me. I like to be able to hang out and just share my knowledge with people. I do encourage you as questions come up. I have two monitors to my left and my right, plus my camera, of course, in the middle. So feel free to drop comments into there. I'm monitoring the chat as I'm going through my demonstrations and everything else. Also, as a kind of an incentive for that, Enterprise DNA is providing a subscription for their site to access all of their content as an award for anyone who is the most active participant and like a chat person in there. And basically, I kind of identify that just by people who are having a conversation. I love the name The Alchemist, by the way. Whoever you are from Brisbane. That's a fun name. I appreciate that, being someone who obviously has a wizard's cape for his avatar. But yeah, so just encouraging you to participate in chats, ask questions, and there I will announce the name at the end of the person who is the most active in the chat notifications in this stream today. But overall, what I want to do, now that I've talked a little bit about myself and giving you a spiel on who I am, let's talk about some of the stuff we'll go over. This is the talk that I have had consistently moving through many years of presenting and stuff like that. And what I want to mention is it's something that evolves, much like just my skill set. So it's kind of a fun grab bag of a lot of cool tips and tricks. And as I come up with new ones, I retire ones out of this talk and move it in. So you could come and see the same talk in a year. It might have a slightly different name, but it's often just going to be really cool techniques and tricks to upgrade and enhance your reports. Another great comparison I like is the everlasting gobstopper from Willy Wonka. If you ever read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that candy that every time you eat it tastes a little bit different, has a different flavor. This presentation is similar to that, just constantly evolving with cool new stuff to go through it. It's also scalable. I can shrink it to half an hour. I can bring it up to an hour and a half, just depending on the platform here. We will probably have objectively about 45 minutes of demo today, so we'll maybe get through 2/3 of this stuff. But there will also be additional content available that I can link you to my YouTube channel if you want to access it later and look up some other cool tips and techniques. Looks like a few others. We got Darren, Joe Blow, Hannah, Philippines, Winnipeg, Canada, and will there be any in-person user group meetings in the Seattle area this year? That's a great question, Darren. I am working with Stefan, who manages we both co-manage the modern Excel user group here, and our plan is later this year, once things lessen up, is to do that. Just as a really quick note on that, our biggest holdup is that we hosted on the Microsoft campus, and they are discouraging in-person meetings on their campus, especially with outside people. So when Microsoft lets us host our user group again there, that's when it will pop up. So stay tuned, but we're kind of beholden to when they will allow us to host meetings there again using their conference rooms. But given everything I've said, I want this to be mostly demonstration driven. So let's go ahead and get started and kind of walk through some of the cool stuff that we have today. All right, I'm gonna close out of this. Let's get you over there for now, and let's start with this one. So this is something that has been, it's one of the few actual topics that has been in my demo since day one. From back in the day, it used to be called unlocking new visualizations and features. With a lot of these techniques that are kind of interesting workarounds or hidden features, I do hope that someday they don't have to be hidden. They don't have to be a workaround. I still like to show them because people might not necessarily know that they exist, but my goal with a lot of this stuff is to provide feedback to Microsoft to make it easier so people don't have to watch a YouTube channel to realize this is a feature, that the act of self-discovery when exploring reports will lead to this. So the feature itself is the fact that we have conditional formatting, little KPI circles that are on the line chart. Now, the line chart natively does not support this. If I actually was to select it, and as an example, come over to any of the settings in here, there's no options for conditional formatting here. If I go to the format painter and look at data colors, same thing. Normally, if you actually had access to conditional formatting, you would see a little thing here with f of x written there. To click it, that would then take you to conditional formatting that will let you customize it. Obviously, we don't have an f of x icon there. For those of you wondering what that would normally look like, I'm referring to one of these. That button, typically when you can color conditionally format or provide some rules or logic to the color, you would see a symbol here, and that is what we do not have in this setting. Now, this was a happy accident. I stumbled upon this like 5 years ago. I was originally starting with a column chart, and the thing that we do have over here, we do have an f of x symbol that lets us apply some conditional formatting into here. Let me go ahead and back out of that. We can see in here it's less important with the logic because I just have some KPI colors for the standard red, yellow, and green that are into there that just color the bars based on what percentage it is, the bottom, middle, and top. And the bars, when you change the visual from a column to a line chart, so let me actually back out of this a couple times. There we go. It gets inherited. So it actually migrates that over. Now, this is one of those things where my first thought is, okay, cool. Is this a bug or a feature? That sometimes is a hard question to answer with certain things you come across in Power BI. But as soon as I discovered this, I emailed Microsoft and like, hey, I found something that I would hope you don't patch, but I want you to be aware that this is a thing. Can I expect this to disappear in a couple of months in a patch? And they assured me that they're not going to actually make this more visible in terms of adding that f of x symbol to the actual line chart itself, but because people have implemented this as a feature in reports, they're not going to get rid of it. So it's a safe thing to implement, and that's what I do with any of these tricks or like workarounds that I do in reporting. Is I will not present anything to you that is not something that can be used in production. So I'm not going to give you half-baked solutions or things that basically will break or have too many issues. Occasionally there might be one or two feature limitations to it, but I won't deliver to you anything that is going to be at risk to breaking down the road to your client. I want these to be things that I teach you that can actually be used in reports. So it's just a nice way to upgrade the default line chart and gives you the option to get little bands that will show up into here and help to kind of further break out your data by whatever things you might be looking for. And other things that I've done as well, like there are some more advanced tricks where I won't get into it on this one, but I do want to mention that you can actually use a measure to color the actual colors themselves, not as a specific color here, but you actually can write a measure to create a transparent color as well. Like there's a way to provide it a hex color that essentially it doesn't understand, and the result of that, if you actually have a measure returning a series of hex colors, is it just returns transparent because it doesn't actually know how to render it. So when you do that, the output, as kind of just a feature mentioned, is you can actually have just certain dots show up, but overall you can actually like scrub the rest of them. So maybe I just want like these, and based on whatever logic it is, there's only 3 or 4 dots that I actually want to show up onto the page, using a bit more advanced logic, and I'm going to build it into my demos at some point. You can actually make all of the other ones except for certain ones based on criteria disappear. So some clever use cases for that, and we'll actually have a demo later that shows that. But from a very basic perspective, it's kind of it's not something that's intuitive. Most people would not think, oh, to get these, I have to start on a different visual, but it does show you at least a multi-step process that results in something that is at least stable. The downside, though, as a limitation, is I can't choose the symbol. So I can't change these to a triangle or a square or anything else, and I can't choose the size. They are limited in that. The only thing configurable is the colors themselves. All right. Let's see, making sure there's no questions. And again, anytime you have those, feel free to drop them into the link. Otherwise, it looks like people are just happy and there's some links being shared, so we're good to go on that. What I will do now is, if you do have a question on this field, feel free to drop it in, but I'm going to minimize this one and I want to move on to my next demo. Got to pull this up. So hide data labels are returning. Yeah, exactly. And like we'll see later on, there's a way to do a measure that returns multiple hex codes, and it can basically be green, red, transparent. So you basically set up the logic, and you, instead of having to show a circle on every single data point, it might only be 3 or 4 of them. So you can like call out just the ones that you actually care about. But let me get my next demonstration up. Where are we at? Right here. This one will actually be a few-step process, but it's one of the ones that I'm more proud of recently that I built out in Power BI. Since I released the video on this, I have seen a couple other people who posted links that have done similar ones. But what I ended up building last fall is a selection for an analytics line that we see here at the top. You might notice that as I'm selecting this, I can actually choose my analytics line. I can have it be the average of my data, the median, in this case, the percentile as well. So various different things that allow me to choose the analytics line, and then the bar itself actually changes colors between the two of these. And as I configure this around, you will see that anything above the line is colored green, anything below the line is colored gray. So it helps to call out the bars that have popped out past the line to, thank you, to be able to do that. So this one I will take some time and spend to go through because there are a few things. But with a lot of my videos, what I like to do is I start with an idea and then I do a video on it and then I figure out a way to enhance it a bit more and I do another video and I keep building it out. So I'll eventually get to the conditional formatting here. But what I do want to start with is how did I build the slicer here at the top that lets me choose between these. The ones that I picked, by the way, are typically what you can actually add to the analytics from the pane here. So if I close this, let me do a more basic visual. Let's do, here we go. I want to show you what the native analytic lines options are. Here we go. So just so you can see that. So normally, this is what you're given. The min, max, average, median, and percentile. So with all of those there, like that's essentially what I reproduced on my slicer. So that's the native ones, but when you do this, you have to pick one of these. You don't have a way to select between them. You just assign one of these lines built into it. So I wanted to have a selection that gave me that same freedom. And this came about because recently Microsoft added a new feature to the analytics line where you can add a x-axis constant line or a y-axis constant line into here. And that's what I added into this. It allows you, normally, you could just say, let's say 10 million. Sure. There you go. So I could do a static value into here, which just, it displays the base value that I have. But instead of that, every time you see this little f of x symbol, and I'll answer your question in a second, it allows me to use a measure instead. So what I've actually done is there is a field value that I'm using, which is a measure, and we'll walk through that here in a minute, but you select the whatever measure it is, that has all the logic, and then that is what's giving me all of these fun things. So we'll show the measure in just a second. I'm going to look at some of these questions. How do you set the label analytics line within your chart? Great question. So that's an easy one, and I'll answer that. Yeah, and like I by the end of this, you will see how I turn the lower values gray. So the question is how do I set the label analytics line within my chart? I'll read out the question just because not everybody can see the question on the chat. So that is done, where are we at? Analytics line, data, here we go. Yeah, so it's under the data label. So if I turn that off, there we go, data label turns off. If I turn it back on, it has an option for data value, name, or both. So that when I select both, that is what gives me both the name, the custom name that I get it, plus the value in here. And the name is assigned up here at the top when you double click onto that. So I just called it analytics line because I can choose what analytics to put into there. But let's actually break down the measure a little bit. This is, I'd say, intermediate DAX, just to show you, but a lot of the links that's been provided there, this is something that I've done a few YouTube videos on, and I also have a blog files page that contains all of the PBX files for this. So if you actually want to go back later, see how this is done, there will be resources too. Oh yeah, the new format panel has so many missing features right now because it's in preview. So I've stopped using it. I've done 2 demos on it. There were 2 menu options that hadn't been added yet that Microsoft now has acknowledged the bug. So there's a reason I don't demo with preview features typically. They're usually half baked, and there have been a lot of issues with the new formatting pane. So I am very specifically avoiding it. The DAX that I want to show you here we are. All right. So the logic isn't particularly complex. What I've done is I've created a switch true statement, and I'll break this down and show you some other measures, but let's just go through each thing at a time. I have here a selection pane for average, median, 2 types of percentiles, inclusive, exclusive, and a percentage of max. And in here, I have a switch statement. It's an if-when, that is check-in conditions. Basically, is my slicer selection, if I have selected average, it is doing an average X, and this part's important. So here, this is looking at the axis here. So it is whatever in my visual, in this case, because the measure does have to be built a bit to find the average of all the values being displayed in the visual, because it doesn't know that. When I add the average line in there, it does not have a context of what is on the axis, because it's just returning a single number for the visual itself with no reference to like how the visual has been configured. So the measure itself does need to point to that, basically the same granularity. So that's why they're all pointing to calendar month and year. So I'm doing an average of all of my calendar month and year values for sales amount, and basically just rinse and repeat that logic down the list. For median, it is the median X function over the unique rows for the month and year, and down the list for the exclusive. And actually that should be INC. There we go. For each of these other ones that is in here. And the one difference with these last 3, you might notice that I also have a percentage selection, because that's typically in this calculation where the K value is returned, and that is like what is the percentile that I'm wanting to return. So I'm going to minimize my DAX measure for just a minute, and that is where this little slicer that has a couple formatting logics in there, not applicable, because there's no reason to set a percentage number for your average or your median. But if I select percentile, then the title dynamically changes to say percentile adjustment. Same thing with if I select the other one, and then if I select percentage of max, the title changes to that, and then that's how I'm able to set those. So these are last 3 basically turn on the slicer to allow me to make those adjustments, and that is what you see represented in this one. So I will walk through the percentage selection in just a minute. The last thing that I want to show, and then I'll check some questions here in just a second, is this analytics selection. So basically, I just have a disconnected table in my model that is this slicer. So let me show you the table to give you some context. That is this table here. And the actual table itself is just something I use the enter data button to add this custom table. I just added a bunch of rows with each of the names. Yes, as I mentioned, these will be available on my website on the blog files page attached to my YouTube videos. So all of these files are in a master repository on my website for blog files. And we just have in here 1 row for each with a sort column to make sure it's in the correct order. But that is all of the calculations that I've had. And I have one measure in here. I can bring that back up. As I mentioned, I'm basically declaring a variable for my analytics selection. And this is a pretty basic calculation right here. There we are. All it is selected value. Basically, if I have a selection made, it just returns the selection. So it's returning the word average, median, and that's how that check is happening in here. There we go. To determine whether or not that slicer is, selecting any of these values into there. So from a base level, we have all of these ones. Let me double check to see if there is. There we go. Is this a visual a good time? The calculation groups could be used. Potentially. The thing that's trickier about this is you're not changing the data necessarily in here. You are changing the slicer selection. And you could also have a calculation group doing that as well. That also predisposes that people are using tabular editor and stuff like that. I usually use calculation groups more for dynamic formatting and other stuff that is a bit more complex to actually funnel the data that is going into a column. But it's kind of a both scenario. Like there might be a way to do this with the calculation group, but I think it would require a few more steps. Either way, the logic is about the same. It just depends on where you're hosting it. So, all right. Okay, so what I'm going to continue to do then, the last part that I want to mention into here, analytics line, I want to mention the percentage selection. So I made this, which is this thing here. This was made using modeling, that's right. New parameter. It is using the new parameter function. It's a what if scenario. So I went into here and I basically provided a decimal number because percentages come as decimals. So it was between 0 and 1 with an increment of 0.01. So like 1% increments, and your default is whatever default you might want to be. It could be like 0.5, so nice and even. Yeah, like in theory, you could do that too. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do disconnected switches. Calculation groups are actually a great way to switch between measures. That's a pretty common scenario where you have a calc group and a slicer that lets you switch from actuals, budget, and forecast. There's 3 or 4 live streams that I have on my YouTube channel that actually talk about calc groups and some really cool ways to use those that I would recommend you checking out later if you're interested in those. But that's how I built this percentage table here. It creates a DAX calculated table. As you can see, there's a generate series there. The oddity that I always found, and I want to just mention this as well, is I'm not going to 1, I'm going to 1.01. Here's the reason. Annoyingly, if I go from between 0 to 1 in a generate series, it doesn't let me actually go to 100%. It stops at 99. If you actually want the slicer to make it all the way to 100, it has to be 101%. I've been lazy and not actually asked Microsoft why that is the case, but that's what I found out. So now I can go to 100%. To me, if I'm going to tell between 0 and 1, I want to be able to go to the last value that I've assigned to it. It shouldn't be n minus 1. It should be n. But it's a small thing that you should be aware of. So whatever number you put in as your max, it's going to be one of these increments less than whenever that value is. So small considerations as far as how the slicer function works. So that is what is basically allowing me to create that dynamic variable, because this has a measure in here. It's my percentage selection. There we go. That actually should be 0 point. And this just simply returns whatever the single value selection is. So when it's at 50% here, it is returning 0.50. And I'm just checking some of the questions. Yeah, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to answer that question later. And if time at the very end of the session, possibly as well. But happy to help you with the sorting question. And that, last but not least, as I mentioned in my analytics line, that is what is being funneled in these sections right here. All of those are basically just that number. So that's allowing me to take the percentile and then dynamically change either of my 2 types of percentiles or my percentage of max that goes into here. So overall, I'm getting a very nice, cool analytics line and slicers to give a huge amount of variation for a client to be able to do lots of different comparisons and slice and dice their data in many different ways. So exactly, yeah, like you don't just have to have a single analytics line anymore. You can make it as dynamic as you need to. So I was very happy that they added that constant line as an option. And then the most recent add-on that I did, because this was a video I did back in October, is the inclusion of something on top of it, which is the 2-color thing. So another new feature that Microsoft released last year that I was very happy for is I'm actually using a stacked column chart. So this thing in here is actually 2 values, sales below selection, sales above selection. So it is actually a 2-value stack chart. That's how I'm able to get the values to show up here. So if you hover over this, oh yeah, I need to turn on my tooltip. There we go. There you are. You have the sales above selection, and you have a total value shown, which is lovely. And you have a sales below selection. The reason I was able to finally do this as a stack chart is one primary reason. They, in the last 6 months, I think it was last fall, they added an option for total labels. This was not something built into a stack column chart before. So total labels both shows the label on the top of the visual, which is lovely, but it also gives that tooltip hover. So you get the total amount. And prior, this was kind of nice, but the annoyance is obviously if anybody wanted a grand total, you would literally have to come and, all right, 13.5 plus 8.7, and you'd have to do mental math to get the exact dollar value or number from this. Really convenient to be able to just turn this on and be able to get that total, regardless if you're stacking over the two. I'll show you the measures in a second, but I have some logic calculating enough to determine basically whether or not that bar, the grand total, is above or below the line. And if it's below, it does some calculations to stack them together. So there's some good logic going on to do this. So let me now, as a final result of this, show you this one. I like this demonstration because there's just so many different things that goes into it, but it just makes for such a unique interactive visualization. Yeah, the conditional formatting is wonderful, and there's tons of cool modeling stuff you can do in Power BI to make a chart super dynamic. Pretty basic, straightforward. We have sales amount, and then we have my analytics line here. The big thing that's important on this is, unlike my analytics line, which I mentioned, this line here, think of this almost like a separate layer on top of my visual. It has no idea really what's behind it. It does not know what's on my axis. It's just basically being loaded solidly into the visual as a single value, not understanding any other filter context. By the time I actually need to do a calculation to determine what this value is uh, at this level, I have to use the all function, because what that does, normally, if I was to ask it to calculate my analytics amount, so if I just ran this by itself with no all filter, for every one of these columns where it's attempting to do that, it is only going to know the analytics value for that single month. Using the all filter here, what that does is it ignores all of this, and essentially it's able to fetch the grand total value. So that's what the all function is doing in there. So that grand total value that's right here, this 8.79, that's essentially what's being retrieved. There we go, for this variable there. And then I just have a pretty standard if statement. So if my analytics amount, and actually I think what I can do, I'll just use my, here we go, I'll use my highlighter. If this amount here, if that is less than my sales amount, essentially meaning that this is above it. So in this case, if that condition is met where my sales amount has risen above my analytics amount, do a subtraction of the two of them. Basically, I want to know what's remaining. Like that's giving me this 1.9. That is this calculation here. Right here is what is being returned for this 1.9 or this 2.4. In this case, this 4 million that's below it, this condition has not been met. So the alternative condition, the false condition, is being returned. And since I don't have anything specified in my false portion of my if statement, that's just returning blank. The default for Power BI in an if statement, if I have not specified it, is the exact same thing had I written this out. I just like to keep my things short and sweet. So instead of actually writing blank as an alternative result, I simply close my bracket. So it only is going to actually return an amount if my original core calculation of sales amount has gone and risen above it. At that point, all these green bars that you see, that's the value being returned for my top section. It's returning just the amount that has been calculated that is above the line. And basically the flip is below it right here. That portion of the below the line, where if the analytics amount is less than the sales amount, so if this thing is less than that, it returns just the analytics amount. So basically that cutoff, it just returns the threshold of that solid bar. Otherwise, it returns the full sales amount, which that one that I'm highlighting here are any of those times where that bar, that column is below the analytics line. So that's how I'm able to stack them together and get that dynamic stacking with all of these. It's just two things that conditionally return a value if they ever fall above or below the line, and they stack together to create that nice little clean effect. And because this is a single visual, I'm not doing any custom layering. I'm able to get a clean grand total because of that new feature for the total labels. So it was able to get an output that for me works perfectly. It works when I also full screen it. That's one issue that sometimes you can have if you actually stack visuals together and everything else. So what do you mean minus VE values? If you can elaborate on that question. Um, and then can the constant line be set dynamically by the user? Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what the slices at the top here are for. This is all something that's part of the published report. So everything you see here, they click this, the line changes as the analytics line moves around. So they have full control over choosing where and what that line is going to be. Any reason why one of the bars is not showing the total? So that happens when data labels are touching each other. So it will automatically, a good question. I have, it doesn't work as well with negative values because you get into some weird scenarios, and I've honestly not tried it. I attempted it briefly. It really works better when the values are solid. You're going to run into complexities when you start handling negative, and I just haven't worked on that yet. So I might someday, but this more has been built out to specifically support only absolute positive values. And otherwise, yeah, to your thing, like the bar I think you're mentioning is the one right here. So that's just because I'm assuming the M is over just enough that it's basically causing this to not show. But you can see that it actually does show up as soon as I focus mode it. So there's the 11 million showing up there. The workaround, if you want to get them to overlap, there should be a setting under total labels. Let's see. Oh, normally there's an overlap option, but apparently they, let's see. Yeah, there used to be a bar overlap, but they don't seem to have that. But that's the only reason you see that is when you when they're too close together. So it will typically show the one to the left as first priority. Okay. But yeah, there's a few things in here. And again, this workbook will be available. It's on my there's a blog files page on my Havens Consulting website, and that's linked to all of the videos that I do on YouTube as well. So every time I do a video, I typically provide a workbook for it. And there is that my YouTube channel has a resource for this. This came out a couple of weeks ago, and you can access that to rewatch this again because I know there are a few steps into there. And you can access the PBX file to download at your leisure as well. I think I was able to track most of the questions. If there are any that I missed, feel free to Control C and copy paste that back into the chat here. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to queue up my next video as well. My next demo as well. Minimize that. There we are. Oh yeah, give me one quick sec. I was going to take a little note. Every once in a while, I notice something in the file as I'm demoing, and then I need to fix, and I'm going to do make a note to change that later. Okay, got it. And charts. All right, make a note for myself for later, minimize that. Perfect. Next thing that we're going to talk about. So another thing that I've come across, let's see. Yeah, I mean, drill through should be fine in that other visual. There's no reason like you wouldn't. If you have something on categories in here where, you want to be able to drill through to another page based off of the, that column in there, it's totally fine. It really just depends on your report setup, which can be very varied, but there's no reason you shouldn't use drill through if you want to on a visual like this. The one that I want to mention here as the next feature that we're going to talk about, notice the colors that I have on this visual here. It goes from black with its lighter colors to white as it gets to a certain darker shade. I was actually inspired to do this based off of some work that I've been doing with InfraRiver more recently, and I've been helping them develop and test out their and do a lot of videos for it's a new custom visual that I don't need to get into. But in the process of that, they had a conditional formatting setting for background colors that also included an option for auto font colors. And like, oh, that's a nifty trick, and that actually answers a solution to a problem that I've often experienced in Power BI. So my issue, let me go ahead and delete this, and so you can see the problem. Sales, yes, that is the one that I want to get rid of. I'm going to remove my font color. So that's the problem. If you use colors that are too dark in a background color gradient, you end up with, situations like this, where it's kind of hard to read the values, and you're sitting there squinting at the monitor. And all right, so solution number one. Solution number one that we can change the colors to be lighter. So okay, that does kind of work, but the problem with this is as you lighten the colors, the gradient becomes less. So then the contrast between the two is also lessened. So like, yes, you can read the text a little bit better, but it's not as to me there's not as much of a stark or identifiable contrast between the light and the dark. So I do like the darker colors because it really draws your eyes to those values that are more important more easily. So all right, well then how do we actually update the font color as well? So I'll show you the logic for that, and it's not particularly complicated, and it also shows you that you can layer your conditional formatting in a native visual. I'll come back to my sales. I'm going to go to font color. Pretty simple. So I have just set up a couple of rules where I have looked based off of like the min and max percentage, the 0 to 25. I've chose to color black, and from 25 to 100, white. So basically it's, whatever the highest percentage is versus the lowest. And sometimes this takes a little bit of tweaking. Like I spent a couple times to, I first started like, all right, well, what about 0 to 50 for black? Let's try that. And, tweaking on if it's too much. I want to break it, so give me one sec. So let's do like, yeah, let's actually do, yeah, 75. There we go. Yeah, so in this case, like, okay, well, at 75%, only these are getting colored white. And maybe this color is dark enough that I do want it to switch there. So it really is just a matter of tweaking where your cutoff is. What is that percentage? Is it going to be 80, 75? And a lot of times that is just playing with your data and just seeing where's the good threshold that is approximately where I want to cut off on. And there's no right answer to this. Like that, a lot of it depends on your data. Sometimes it might take giant leaps. Like you might have a value that is at the 50 percentile and then percentage, and the next one is like 80%. So it really is just a matter of opening it up. Because of this, I do wish there was a way to click update. I would love to come into here and set it and have a button for update so I can keep this window open so I could just easily tweak the number. So you do have to close and reopen the window every time, but eventually you find it like, all right, well, let's try it, 25, and then just making sure your logic is set up. And at that point, oh yeah, there's the cutoff that seems to be at the appropriate level that works for me. But it's really fun to be able to do this, and I think again it has now unlocked kind of a both and for me. I can make my color as dark as I possibly want, and then the font switches when it needs to. So it allows for a kind of a best of both worlds. Easy to set up, is a nice example of layering for conditional formatting. And again, I was inspired by like another custom visual that did it automatically. And anytime I see a custom visual doing something, I try to figure out, all right, can I do it natively in Power BI without having to download something else? And this was a nice solution for that. Similar is the thing that you see with the bars, the kind of the year-over-year sales. The issue that you could have before is that if I get rid of the font color, there we go. Same problem. Nearly impossible to read. Like, all right, so the one option is you can make the bars very light or kind of go with a neutral. Now this one's a little trickier because here's examples where the font isn't just over the bar, it is also over the background as well. So your two avenues for this is you make the bars lighter. It solves everything. You have the bars light enough that black text still shows up against it, or you do a hybrid color. I chose kind of a in-between gray that shows both on a dark color and a white background. So like that's the in-between on this one. And if I sales, check the font color on this as well. And I honestly probably don't even need the two shades. I tried to do two shades of gray depending on how much it's passed over, but really you probably honestly only need this one. There you go, 100. Yeah, and it pops up on both avenues, but same kind of concept. But instead of choosing white, I am choosing a in-between gray color that can exist in both worlds there. But it's something that I'm surprised I hadn't thought of for years, and only until 8 months ago, considering how long conditional formatting has been in Power BI. But it's a fairly straightforward calculation. The percentage on year-over-year sales, it's just how much versus prior year. It's current year minus prior year divided by prior year. Pretty standard year-over-year calculation. That's more or less related to the focus of this one. But if you want to explore all of those calculations, the PBX file, I'll encourage you to go grab that from my site and download that later. All the measures are exposed, and you can play with it at your leisure. Reid, what is the visual used by say? Yeah. So this one, it's also a fun example of using really fun tooltips to explain something. Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. Absolutely. So I have a little tooltip to explain this because it's a unique visual. This is from the Microsoft Store. It is a terrible name. It's called a chord. It's a chord visual. It's like it's not a pretty word at all. But it's a really cool visual that shows relationships between things. So I have two categories, from and to. So what of my data from country goes into class? So think of it as like a flow chart that shows between them. So I have my country on one side, class on the others, but it shows the distribution. Like you can see United States, and then all of the data, where does that go from? Most of it goes into the product category of regular, some goes into economy, but it's just a nice way to kind of see the relationship connecting wires between all of that. So I really like the visual quite a lot, and also has always interesting. I've had a couple people tell me it's chord. Maybe it is the chord visual, but uh, English language is fun for you. So there you go. But yeah, it's a very useful visualization, especially for showing relationships between them. That and the ribbon chart are two of my favorites for that. But it is from the Get More Visuals. I'll look it up. There you go. Microsoft built it quite a few years ago. It's probably their highest rated one too. There's a couple of bad visuals that are in the in the marketplace, but this is one of the cooler ones that I was really liking. What is the conditional formatting based on? Oh yeah, no worries. So yeah, like that's the visual in the corner. And just as I mentioned in this, by the way, I have a report tooltip on this. It's another thing that I actually did a video on a few years ago. Where is it? Yeah, visual header tooltip way down at the bottom. It's connected to my chord visual page, and I just built out a pretty little page with some text, little icon that's in the header and everything. So like that's basically just what I built out onto this page. I just built an information page that explains exactly how this visual works, and that can be useful sometimes if you have a visual that is not intuitive, or maybe it's an advanced visual that people might need help with, and then you can get little information buckets in there. To the question for Greg, you had one about the KPI icons and my year-over-year sales percentage. So that, conditional formatting, icons, and I'm using the icon sets. That was something added a couple of years ago to Power BI, where they basically brought in the Excel icons and the Excel icon sets, with an option to also bring in custom icons as well. So super useful little way to provide those. And it's also my recommendation too, if you're using just colors as a indicator for bad and good. From accessibility reasons, it's often good to then pair that with something like an icon or something else to make sure that it's readable for people who might have difficulties or challenges discerning just color KPIs. So it's colors can consider them secondary, where shapes for anybody that can see the report page can identify those as good or bad. Let's see, just making sure there's no other questions. I'll probably do about one more demo or so, and then I'll open it up to questions at the end, where we can do more open-ended ones. I try to do a Q&A session at the end, not only on what I've shown, but also if you have general questions as well. So if you have those, feel free to start queuing them up and then putting them in. Brian, have I seen Ed Freeman's blog on this topic? It's crazy to ask for parsing the hex code and computing for any color where the font color switch should be. I have not, so feel free to send that on later. I'm always interested in learning anything new about conditional formatting. Is there a way to hide the filter and header icons at the top of the graphs? Yep, that one I can actually show now. And then I think because some other questions are coming in, I'll save the rest for later. Greg's, I will just quickly answer yours. If you want to hide all the icons at the top, that is the visual header section for any visual. I can hide them all in mass at once by just toggling this off. Alternatively, if I open this up, I can choose every single one individually. If I don't want drill down, I can hide that. If I don't want my information, or if I don't want my focus mode, so that can be completely customized. All right. Note. Joe Blow, if you can elaborate your question, I'll get to that later, but let me do my last demo. Where are we at? Dynamic font color. We're going to close you. And yeah, let's do one button one. This is one that I like a lot. So last kind of thing to show you a bit of magic with button design. So this was a client scenario where they wanted a radio toggle for their buttons. And I'm going to, you can basically toggle it to show you that, but you can see that there's like a little slider where I can slide these back and forth. 3 little states. And this was something that I first considered can I do a custom image and anything else like that. And I ended up being able to do this entirely with native buttons. This is something that was built completely out of native features with not much else going on to it, but I just wanted to walk you through the way to build this out so you can kind of see that a little bit. So number one thing that's important in here is the fact that you have an option for buttons among many other configurations for rounded edges. So regular buttons are square. If you add a certain number of pixels into here for a rounded edge, you get more of that pill shape that you might be looking for to be able to have the little slider that moves back and forth across it. Also some states that are also capturing this. So this button here has the shape that we've already discussed. Similarly, I basically have three states that can be declared for button. For those of you who used them, you have your default, which is static on the page. You have a hover. That is what it looks like when you hover over it. So I chose middle and a neutral gray color, and then we have on press, which is over on the left. So all three of these creates kind of that illusion of, sliding left and right to trigger something. And the thing that I had fun with is the fact that my text in here, we have a fancy, handy dandy little thing in our repository where you hold the Windows key and you press colon. There we go. You get an emoji keyboard that pops up. Beautiful feature of Windows 10. I learned about this a few years ago, and it was one of those just like mind blown. This is great. I used to have to go to, Google and basically look up emojis. I did not realize there was a built-in pop-up for this. But if I search for something like circle, I get a circle that shows up. So I actually use an emoji circle because it has a couple of other things in here. It has the black line that's around it, so it's formatted a little bit nicer than just a simple black dot, which I could have used as well as an ASCII dot. This one I specifically chose to do. I will say that there is a consideration. The emoji library between operating systems is a little bit different. So they all share a common library of symbols like this. There is a white circle emoji for Apple, Android, Windows, Linux, and so on. It might look a little bit different. Like Windows has thick borders around everything. Exactly. I mean, it does help it to stand out. But the one on Android, it might be a circle without a line around it. The Apple one might have a little bit of shading on it. So it is the Windows key and colon. So equivalent of this, I'll just show it up on my notepad. Plus this. There. That's the shortcut for that. You also could do an image potentially as well. If you wanted to do an icon, that is something you can consider doing. But for this, I did the text. My only thing that I'm just mentioning as the caveat is when you load this, just be aware of the operating systems that people are loading this on, because it will change slightly how that emoji looks depending on the OS that they're running. How do you adjust position when you switch state? That's a great question. So notice that my default state has a right horizontal alignment. On hover is centered. So that's how I'm getting it in the middle. And then on press is over on the left when I click it. So that's how I'm able to get that sliding, because I'm changing the alignment with each one. So it's really nice way to just choose the alignment and it automatically moves it over for you between those two. So like the vertical and horizontal alignment gives you a lot of flexibility to really customize many different looks and feels with the buttons. They've added so many features recently, like the additional shapes, shadows and glows are new, also is the rotation. So I've seen so many cool videos in the last 6 months come out on super unique ways to design buttons, and people who are more of a artist and designer than even I am, who are coming up with really cool stuff. Like former web designers and I would say like website artists have come up with some really cool unique button designs. But this is just kind of a basic one that I think just shows you how uniquely a button can look outside of just being a square box with a word to say click me. Like you can really do a lot of cool aesthetic designs and changes. And the final effect that you get is that toggle here. And what I am doing, by the way, just as this last wrap up here, and I'll want to mention my selection pane, observe a couple of things. So as I switch between these two, notice that I have actually two buttons on my page. I have an area button, which is hidden, and a column button, which is visible. And as I actually toggle between these two, the visibility changes. So not only does my chart on my page change, The other thing that changes is I'm actually toggling between two buttons. If I show both of these at the same time, there are technically two buttons that are stacked on top of each other. So that's how I'm able to get the effect where the default switches from right to left. I'm hoping someday that they add a fourth state somehow into the buttons where, and I'm trying to describe like what I would like to see someday. I would love a fourth identifiable state where it could be default, hover press, and then bookmark activated state, because I believe there is a way to identify if the bookmark assigned to this button is active or not on the page. And if it is, I want to configure a fourth state because that button's been activated. So now this is what I want it to look like now that the bookmark assigned to it has been toggled. But because that fourth state does not exist today, you do have to have kind of two versions of the button that's basically like inactive and active to switch visibility between. So there's a little bit of extra work there, but you just have to kind of stack them on top of each other and then toggle the visibility between the two. The one thing that really helps with this is when you turn on Snap to Grid. So with Snap to Grid, I can resize a button and then really easily, if I get a new button, because it's snapping both in size and position, I can instantly pixel perfect that button to snap on top of something else. So I don't have to go to the general settings and adjust the pixels. It snaps exactly to the same size. So that's how I'm able to get them to stack on top of each other so easily. And maybe actually better if I do it with this one. There we go. That's how I'm able to get them to stack perfectly, really quickly, is using the snap to grid option without having to muck around with. Previously, it would be the settings that I would have to normally adjust. I would come into here, I would change the positions, the width, the height, and I'd have to, to make it pixel perfect from this area. So Snap to Grid is a wonderful, quick and easy solution. That's also how I typically space my objects onto the page. Like this border, that's one snap from each other. It's a one snap spacing, which is 8 pixels, by the way. Every snap, height and width, should have been the other way, height and width. It's 8 pixels that it moves. Every time you move something, every time you something, it is 8 pixels at a time when it snaps. All right, let's see. We're getting close to the hour, so I want to check a couple of other things in here. A lot of people happy. I'm appreciated that you're enjoying this stuff. If the circle is the text, where does the column chart text come from? Ah, yeah, good question. So that is a text box next to it. There isn't really any other way to like get it to the right. You can't add a title to the right, so I just added a text box next to it that is in this section. Like it is a grouped object where there is my button, and then here is just a text. Or actually, no, I used a button in this case to make that as well, and then I just put the column chart into here. So another thing that I actually like about buttons, even for text nothing else other than just show a label like this, and this is the little bit of a pet peeve of mine. So let's add a text box. Now I have this text box on my page. I want this text to be front and center. I can center align it, but I don't have any way to put it into the middle. And the problem right now is it's technically a little bit closer to the bottom than it is to the top. Like I can indent it. I can try things where maybe I decrease the font size here to get it to fit better, but it's just really annoying to try to get that font perfectly centered in that text box for me. And as I'm developing, this never goes away. There's just no way to delete that. If I click the text box formatter has to be at the top. Now with a button, and they load about the same onto the page. If you're wondering about performance, a button here, there we go. I just want this to be front and center, so I'm going to turn on the text. Just put some text into there. It shows up in the middle. I can just turn off the outline. I can make sure that there's no action or visual header. I have a text box now that is front and centered and aligned, and I just find it easier to use most of the time. If I'm not doing rich text where I don't need to bold, italicize, underline, or do anything fancy with it, if I just need a label, I often use buttons just because it's easy for me to get it perfectly pixel perfect in the middle than it is for me to use the text box to do the same thing. So that's one of the reasons that I use them often in replacement of simple text versus the actual text box in Power BI for that exact reason of alignment. Yeah, stacked on top. Let's see, there are a couple of questions being answered. Yeah, there is no vertical align option for the text box visual. That only exists for this. And I don't have time to go over it today, but I often actually use a button as a single value card because sadly the single value card does not do top, bottom, left, and right. It only displays the middle. And what about if I wanted a card value that actually was maybe like front and up? Like if there's any kind of tweaking that I want to move my number around on, I can't in a single value card. So there's been times when I've used buttons as visuals because of that reasoning. Exactly, yeah. So, any other questions? Let's see. I think I saw a couple of others that I'm going to scroll down. Uh, Oh, nice. Live streaming questions. And one thing I will actually have to, to give a couple of seconds on is to think who was the most active. Brian, if you have a 2 cents on that, because I was monitoring the questions, but I wasn't scanning the names as much. If you have a contender that you think was very obviously the most active, let me know, because otherwise I might actually have to scan through and double check to see who was commenting most. Because I think it was pretty close between a few people. But let's see. If you had any other questions, though, I don't think I see any others. Can you copy and paste if I missed it? And then I will happily answer those as we start to wrap up, and I'll have a few links for you as well to close up for the day. All right. Yeah, thank you, Darren. Greg, you had a question. Can you replace the text box with a tooltip and increase the transparency so the text only comes up when you hover? So I think what you're asking on is this. Yes, you could. I wanted a label that just kind of represented what was being displayed as an example, but another thing you could do for a button, you do have an option. It'll probably be better over here uh, to provide a example. Here's a little trick too. Is tooltip. Show column chart. There you go. So you could have something like that where you have a custom tooltip that pops up when you hover over it. The transparency, I don't believe you can configure for this. So that's the one downside is it's just going to be the color of the default tooltip, but you do still get at least the pop-up that I think you were alluding to. What is your cool picture on the background? Oh, do you mean behind like actually behind me on the camera? Oh yeah, on the wall. So it's something called Nano Leaf. Nanoleaf. They're little triangular light panels that can assemble into a pattern. I built that into a kind of a mountain range, but it's something that I needed to put a splash of color from like YouTube videos. So I ended up buying that to make it a bit more fun. Like you can actually change the colors here. You can see like I can make it into red. I got a few other little like I have a little cube that actually changes the colors and all sorts of stuff. So it's a fun little thing to have in the background. But buttons sometimes hide or overlap on other visuals or shapes. How to overcome that? Uh, well, if you have an overlap issue, the other one is without looking at your bookmark configuration, they're very tricky to set up. So I would actually need to see the workbook file and see why you're having an issue with things hiding. The button was just not made correctly. If you have an issue with overlap, though, that specifically I can answer. So here's an example. In desktop, like somebody clicks the background. Well, shoot, now I have an issue where this is popped up into the front. It happens in desktop, but when you publish this to the web in reader mode, the solution to that is you come to general and you make sure this option for maintain layer order is turned on. That will ensure that anything that is in a group will not pop up to the front. So it ensures that everything is maintained in the order that it is in the selection pane. So you won't get any like unnecessary pop-ups. Unfortunately, it's not reflected in desktop because in development mode, that will still happen. But as soon as you actually publish to web, then it fixes it. I'm still begging Microsoft. I would love to come to view. There needs to be a button that says like preview reader mode. So I can actually see all the effects of my configurations for publishing. The only way to do that right now is you have to publish your workbook and you have to go test it in the service. And like it's annoying when you have a 150 megabyte model that takes 5 minutes to publish every time you need to publish a change. So it is turned off by default. You have to turn that on. So maintain later order is off by default. Let me go ahead and actually throw up my links because I know a few of you probably might need to be going to another session. So let me spin this back up, put this here, and I'll continue to answer questions while I have these up. There we are. Yeah, so QR code that takes you to my main site. I will And I need to check for Brian's thing here in just a second on the person that's winning. A couple things that I want to encourage you to do. I have a few links for my presentation and some of the stuff that I provide. Also, check out the Enterprise DNA website. There's a lot of great content onto there. I think at this point they probably have more content really than anybody else does when it comes to training on everything within the Microsoft stack and more. Really cool things. Regarding specific things that I do, I have a YouTube channel and a LinkedIn, so I encourage you to check those out at the bottom. If you like my stuff, it really helps to grow my business for people who subscribe to my YouTube and just help the YouTube gods continue to promote my stuff. So that's going to be something that's useful. I do sell a few things that like a Google Analytics report, a calendar table, a couple of Power BI quick and easy to use templates. So that basically that little discount code gets you a 30% off of the couple of the files that I sell on my site. And otherwise, I encourage you, if you have any questions on Power BI, you are welcome to just drop me a line on LinkedIn and I'll answer some of that stuff. So, Brian, thank you for that. I would say as well, Greg, I think you probably have had the most questions that I've answered at least for some of those. So yeah, like I'll point you out as the person who is the most active or at least question asker on the chat today, and contact. I don't know if it'll be Brian or who else on here, but they'll I think at least reach out to you and figure out logistics for you to get a free subscription to the Enterprise DNA site. So congratulations on that. But otherwise, let's see if there was any other questions that I missed. I'll scroll through. Lots of nifty ideas. Thank you. Could you place your website onto here? Looks like the links were dropped into there. So yeah, I think that's all the questions then. It's been really fun today. Thank you for being an active channel um, conversation and everything else, and it's been really fun. Yeah, I encourage you as kind of my last little takeaway. I do a live stream every week on my YouTube channel. I bring on guests from the community, both people from Microsoft, other MVPs, industry experts, and think of it as kind of like fun webinars. And I just get to hang out. I get to talk to people in my live chat and everything else, and it's a really fun way for me to just involve myself in the community. So if you like stuff like this, there's going to be more stuff that Enterprise DNA is going to keep putting on, and I do my own live streams as well that I would encourage you to check out. So otherwise, then yeah, thanks Enterprise DNA for hosting. This has been really fun. The recording for this should be on later, and hopefully see some of you guys as well, maybe on some of my live streams.